Hello everyone, Ron again, and in today's video, the topic is reverb. So let's start off by talking about what reverb is. Reverb occurs when a sound bounces off of a surface and it reverses direction and also polarity. So it bounces off of a surface, it bounces off of another surface, and it reverberates between bouncing off of every surface that's in the area. But because sound moves so fast, we don't hear it as many echoes. We hear it as one sound because the brain perceives it as being one sound. So that's what reverb is. You could think of reverb as a series of really fast successive echoes that blend together so we perceive it to be one sound that decays over time rather than thousands of tiny sounds that slowly decrease in volume. What are some of the uses of reverb and why is it important? Reverb is used for several things actually. One thing that I'm going to show in this video is that you use reverb to take up space in a mix, not spectral space because you don't want mud necessarily, but space over time because one concept that is important musically is that you use silence, but you don't want to have too much silence so that the momentum of the piece is lost. I'm going to show that in my example for today, in one of them. So another reason, besides taking up space temporally in a song, is that we want things to sound like they are in a similar location, right? So what this means is when you are in a room or an area and a sound is made, the reverb is going to bounce off of the surfaces, yes, but every sound that's made is going to bounce off those same surfaces. So something like panning an object would affect whether we hear the object coming from the left or right, but reverb would affect us hearing it being at a distance. So it can sound farther away because of how we know ourselves to perceive reverb. In the same way in the delay video, I was talking about how you think of delay and echoes, and the first thing that comes to mind for me is when somebody yells at a mountain and then their voice comes back and they think of that echo. That's what you think about when you think of delay. When you think of reverb, you think of the sound of being in a bathroom or a room with really thin walls and the sound bounces everywhere, but every single sound bounces in the same way. So because we understand that we perceive reverb that way, that's why it's important that the reverb is used in, people use the term glue usually to talk about compression, but in a sense, reverb brings everything into the same space for that reason, because if everything is in the same room, then everything is going to share the reverb character of that room. So those are major reasons why you would use reverb. Creating pads is another one. And, sound design, obviously, because it's going to make something sound like a softer sound, in addition to ADSR. But what's cool about this video is that I'm going to segue from talking about mono into talking about clarity. So I'm going to use reverb to do that because it applies to both. Before you understand why, I'm going to explain Fruity Reverb 2 and the normal characteristics of reverb. So let's look at the functions of the reverb parameters. You have low cut and high cut. Low cut cuts the lower frequencies as you increase it. It cuts more of them. High cut cuts more of the high frequencies as you decrease it. So high cut, think of a low pass filter. Low cut, think of a high pass filter. Delay, this is pre-delay, which you need because if you want to replicate some big sounding room, you have different reverb times that are associated with different spaces. So if the sound has to bounce off of a wall that's farther, then the reverb will take longer to reach you in a bigger room. So delays how fast you hear the reverb relative to the original signal, and you can see in the top left how long the reverb will take after the initial sound. And that's the purpose of that. In a bigger room, to make it sound more realistic, the reverb would take longer to come back. So pre-delay would simulate that distance of the sound traveling and then hitting the wall and then returning to you. Size is straightforward. It's the size of the room. Then you have diffusion, which is going to make the reverb sound more metallic or more, say, smooth. That's something that you adjust with your ears, because it's one of those things that you shouldn't overly focus on and become crazy about trying to understand. Just listen to it. Modulation modulates the reverb time. You can see more about that in the manual. And it's going to produce an effect that's sort of like pitch alteration or like the chorus effect. And this is how much that effect is pronounced. And this is how fast the modulation happens. Bass multiplier is something that you use because you want to have warmer reverb, possibly, or you want to change the color of it. So you're going to boost frequencies that are below a certain point, or you're going to decrease those frequencies below a certain point in the reverb. Crossover is that point. So if you look at the top left-hand corner, you see what frequency it is, and below that frequency, bass is boosted by this amount. Not literal bass, because you wouldn't usually apply reverb to bass because it creates mud, but just the bass frequencies relative to the reverb, the ones that are below that point. So don't be confused by that. It goes back to what I said before about how sometimes people use the same words throughout music production, but they don't always mean the same thing. This is a case like that. Dampening, as you turn it higher, is going to make it so that you hear less high frequencies in the reverb. Why? Because a sound that's farther away will come back with less high frequencies. It loses power over time as it reverberates to come and reach you. So if it is further away from you, it's going to sound darker. So as you dampen it, you're going to make it sound farther away. Possibly the most important parameter is the decay time, and this is how long the reverb takes to decay fully. So I have this one set to 2.9 seconds because of what I was doing with the two reverbs together when I was setting up this project earlier. So I'm not going to change that, but just know if you have a shorter reverb time, it usually is better towards avoiding mud. You have this tempo switch that I didn't mention, but it causes the pre-delay to become synced to the project, so you can set it to like quarter notes and stuff. So that's useful for that. People like to set reverb to be a 16th note long, so that would be useful for maintaining clarity and having reverb in the sense of space or depth without masking other sounds. And you've got the final four parameters over here. You have the dry signal, which is sort of like how much you're going to mix into it of the dry signal. If you are sending the reverb to a different channel because you want to control the reverb in its own mixer track, then it's common practice to set this to 0 and set wet to 100%. The wet signal is the reverb by itself. ER stands for early reflections, which goes back to just understanding what reverb is. Because a sound has to bounce off of something and reverberate between multiple surfaces, there's going to be a reverberation or a reflection that hits you first. So if it is closer to you, that reflection will be louder. So the early reflections relative to the entire sound overall are affected by this slider. And that's the reason why it's important. Considering all those things together, if you were in a small room, the small room would have a low decay time. It wouldn't have a lot of high cut. It might not have a lot of low cut because everything is so close. So you would hear the reverberation of most of the sound. It would be a small size because all the walls are close. There wouldn't be a lot of dampening, so the high frequencies would reach you. And the early reflection would be loud. And it would have a greater amount of reverb or wetness relative to the amount of dry. So those are things to consider. This last knob right here is the stereo separation of the reverb. Set all the way to the right is mono. Set all the way to the left is uncorrelated. All of these parameters will apply to Fruity Reverb because this is Fruity Reverb 2, which means it's essentially the same. It's just built with more features. One thing that I didn't mention is this mid-side switch right here. And what it does is it switches the reverb so that it will only apply reverb to the side information of whatever source. Because Fruity Reverb 2 is also intended to be used as a mastering reverb. There are reasons why you would put reverb onto a master bus of a track. And obviously it wouldn't be fully wet like it is here. You will have mostly the dry signal because you don't want mud and you don't want the mix to disappear. But there are reasons why you would do it, even though they are far and few between. I feel like that's something that people do not know about this plugin, which is one of the things I mean if you ever hear me say that FL Studio has stuff that's really powerful, but people are just unaware about it. So that's one example. You could just affect the side information with reverb, and that is just awesome. Again, all of the things that I said will apply to Fruity Reverb. When you see similar parameters, over here it says pre-delay, room size. The color is warm, that's pretty cool. So it's all controlled in one slider. It gives you more fine control in Fruity Reverb 2. Decay, high damping, the dry signal, and reverb, the wet signal. So recall earlier how I was describing that this video would bring everything together. Look in this mini synth, you got the chorus effect, you got phaser, you have delay, ADSR, filter and resonance, the oscillator tab, which is mandatory anyway because this is where the sound comes from. There's no LFO, but it just wouldn't sound right in this. But it's going to take a lot of these ideas and it's going to combine them together. This is a preset I created called Aqua, and it has reverb added to it. So let's look at it with the reverb turned off actually. One thing you notice is that with the reverb turned on, you can really hear the presence of the phaser. But now if I turn it on, one immediate contrast is that the sound of the phaser is noticeably less present. Now, let's look at what I was talking about earlier when I said that you use reverb to cover musical space. So check this out. If I turn off the reverb again and I just play some chords, notice that there was a considerable space in between the chords. Now if I turn the reverb on, in the case where I've implemented a somewhat longer delay, it's going to fill that gap. Check it out. So consider implementing that idea in a musical context. This would mean that if you just wanted to have that one chord playing over the measure, and you want to have this sound that sounds wide and it sounds epic and grandiose, it's going to be difficult to do that with just a synthesizer because it's going to sound too buzzy over the course of time. The reverb is going to smoothen out that sound and it's going to fill in that gap because, as you heard, I was just playing a single chord. It was an extended chord, but it would decay more quickly without the addition of reverb. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm going to allow the reverb to become muddy and clutter everything else if I was mixing this, but this will be a consideration that I will have. The reverb is going to add character and it's going to transform the entire sound. And in this case, it's also affecting the stereo field. So we're going to talk about mono briefly. But before I get into talking about mono, I just want you to consider one third reason why you might use reverb, and that's just to create an atmospheric presence, like a pad, because you could hear when I was playing those sounds that they make it sound more dynamic and ethereal. So consider that from the standpoint of writing for something that's like a motion picture, right? And when I'm creating sounds, I am considering what the sound could represent in a context, in any particular context, whether I'm writing a song or whether I'm thinking of something that is happening. I'm trying to describe that thing musically, and reverb is a big part of that. So naturally, the vector scope is here, and the sound is not set to mono, but this is my segue into talking about clarity. So I have to talk about mono because it's a segue. If mono wasn't mentioned, it just would be wrong. But it is important to consider mono because if I want this same ethereal character I have to play back on a mono stereo system, I have to consider how much of that information is actually going to be able to keep. And I had to consider how much I want it to keep. You know, I had to think about the tone and the color of the reverb and the potential for information being lost beforehand. So look here, the reverb is panned left and right. Fruity Reverb 2 is panned left, Fruity Reverb is panned right. So this is the way that I've elected to endeavor toward mono compatibility, and the reverbs both have some of their stereo information taken away. They're closer to becoming mono, but they're not entirely mono, so they're still going to have stereo width in stereo, but in mono they don't disappear. So I'm going to play this sound, and there's a few things I want you to consider as I'm playing this on this keyboard. First, consider this in a movie where one character is thinking about another character and how they feel about them. Consider the atmospheric presence of the reverb, and at the same time look at the vector scope and notice that it won't disappear in mono. So those three things. Consider how the reverb is affecting the sound. Consider how it would make you feel to watch it if somebody was thinking about somebody else while you heard this playing. And consider the stereo field, that you can have it all because it won't disappear. Here we go. So consider one character considering another character, and the first character is thinking, I really love this person. And, you know, if you know that song, the lyrics of it, wherever you go, whatever you do, I will be right here waiting for you. That person is thinking fondly of another person, and they're thinking about how much they love them, maybe even staring at them. Maybe a boat is carrying that person away and they're going off on a long journey and they're thinking about how no matter where they go, they will always love them. And that's playing in the background to emphasize that concept. So it's being represented musically. And maybe it pans to the other character who's staring at that character leave, who they love, and it's showing their facial expression. And you're hearing the music and you're receiving all of this at the same time. So you're considering all of those things. But now, what if that atmosphere disappeared in mono and you didn't hear the reverb and you just heard a buzzy synthesizer? So, not to belabor the point, it's just that if someone listens to your music even outside the theater, because the theater is going to have stereo, right? It's just set up that way, of course. But if they listen to it outside, say, think of a song like the song from Titanic by Celine Dion. I want to hear that song, and if I've seen the movie, I want it to create nostalgia for me. There's other popular songs that have lasted the test of time, and people associate particular topics with them, whether that's what the song is about or not. Think of Born in the USA. Think of 99 Red Balloons. So you want to hear the song when you listen to it anywhere. You want to hear it as it sounded when you first heard it, or as close as possible. No, you don't want parts of it to just entirely fade away and disappear because it works nostalgically for you. So you have to consider that when you're writing a song. You say to yourself, if I write this song and somebody associates it with something, then I want them to always have that memory every time it's played. So consider a song like Thinking Out Loud by Ed Sheeran. If somebody was married and they used that as their wedding song, right? Or For You by Kenny Lattimore, and you remember that occasion every time you hear that song. So if you hear it somewhere where it's reproduced in mono and it disappears, it messes up your nostalgia. But if you write the song and you consider that you want this person to have this experience with it, you want them to love that song, you want it to bring up memories and feelings of passion maybe that they had forgotten about. Because I listen to music and it takes me back to earlier times. I remember what I felt during good times and sometimes during bad times. And it's good to reflect on how far you've come. You want your music to have that type of impact and to do that to people. And so mono is a small example, but it's a super important one because your song just can't disappear in mono if that's going to happen. And with that, that is what I had prepared for this video. In the coming videos, I'll be talking about clarity and how to try to avoid muddiness and how to clarify different things, maybe through using synthesizers and, of course, techniques like compression and why and when you do things, how I use them, and things of that nature that will sound less vague when the videos are actually made. So, as usual, I thank you for watching and have an awesome day. Peace.